This is Entre Ed Talk, the podcast for entrepreneurial educators by entrepreneurial educators. We are your hosts, Toy Hirschman and
Amber Ravenscroft. This podcast is created by the National Consortium for Entrepreneurship Education, or Entre Ed for short. Hey everyone, we are so excited to be back for another episode of Entre Ed Talk, and I'm super excited to be here today with one of my fellow UPenn classmates, but she has a lot more cool stuff under her belt. We are here with Regina Rosi Mitchell. She's the Director of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Marlborough School, a private all-girls school in LA, California. Upon completion of her Fulbright Fellowship researching education in Mexico, Regina taught Spanish for 10 years at the school. Believing that kids, especially girls, become more confident, curious, creative, and empathetic when exposed to entrepreneurial thinking, she launched the school's first ever entrepreneurship program, partnering with startups so students solve real business problems. Regina is passionate about vlogging on parenting and education, teaching entrepreneurship to girls, and the future of independent schools. Hi, Regina.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah, it's funny. It's always funny to hear your bio read to you. So
it's a good one, promise.
We are so excited to have you, Regina. I'm so excited to meet you. I just met Regina on this podcast just now, so that's exciting. And I'm so excited to hear more about what you do and your contribution to the world of entrepreneurship education. What's interesting to us is that we work mostly with public schools when we work in the K through 12 space. And so you are at a private school. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about Marlborough School and how the private school landscape is different from where we work mostly in public schools.
Right. Well, I'm actually a product of public schools. I went to a really small rural public school in Michigan for my entire K through 12 experience. And I never thought that I would end up in a private or an independent school. But what happened for me was when I graduated from college and was looking for a job, I considered going and getting my master's and my teaching credential, but there was so much red tape around it that I said, you know what, I can just start teaching right away in an independent school, because that's one of the first differentiators, is that you don't necessarily need a teaching credential to teach in an independent school. They value more, what you majored in college, if you went to grad school, what your other experiences are. And so I just wanted a job right away. And so that was how I ended up there. But that's definitely one of the main distinguishing factors. But in terms of the school landscape, I think the biggest difference with an independent school is you have to charge tuition. And then another main form of generating revenue is through donations, be it from alums, be it from current parents, past parents. And the independent school landscape is really quite interesting because the cost of an education is not covered by the cost of tuition. And so you look at the financial model of independent schools, and as tuition continues to rise, I think independent schools have to really be very clear about their value proposition and what they offer, especially as charter schools are growing and becoming more innovative in their curricular offerings. And then, some schools or some areas have really great public schools as well. And so independent schools fall within that as an option, but as tuition rises, it's changing quite a bit. So that's pretty much the main difference. And then, of course, there is an application process. And so independent schools can be choosy, or they essentially choose who ultimately attends.
It's interesting to me. I mean, I hail from, my background in education is from rural Western Maryland. I grew up in the school system, and then West Virginia, where charter schools are not a thing. There's very limited school choice. I mean, Maryland has charter schools, but not Western Maryland. So it's interesting to hear about the perspectives and differences in terms of private, charter, right, public, just because that's so limited where I grew up and where we're based primarily. Right. So tell us a little bit about Marlborough. Am I saying that right?
Yeah,
how do I say that?
Well, it's pronounced like the cigarette company. Marlborough. But it's spelled like the English way. Okay. So Marlborough I had never heard of Marlborough before I essentially got a job there. But Marlborough is actually the oldest all-girls school west of the Mississippi. It was established in 1889, and it has an amazing founder story. In fact, if you look even on the East Coast, a lot of your boarding schools or independent schools, many of them had a female founder. And so like there's Agnes Irwin and there's Ethel Walker and there's Miss Porters. And they're all named after the founder. But in our case, our founder was this woman named Mary Caswell, and she moved. It's a pretty amazing story. In, I guess it was maybe 1888, maybe it was 1889. She caravanned across the country, single woman, and just had this idea that she wanted to start a school on the West Coast. And she set up originally in Pasadena, California, which is in an area slightly outside of LA. And they resided in the Marlborough Hotel. And that was how, we got our name. And then a few years later, moved to our current location. So Marlborough is in Hancock Park, which is in Midtown LA. And it's a fascinating place to teach because Hancock Park, originally known as so it's this beautiful area within this huge city. And then we're bordered by Koreatown and Beverly Hills. Hollywood is right there. And so it's LA is a very diverse city, but since it started so long ago when they plopped down where we are right now, like Wilshire wasn't even fully developed. All the streets around it, which are now these huge arteries to manage LA traffic, didn't exist. And so that's a bit of the history of Marlborough, but we are a 7 through 12 school. We have 530 students. We are college preparatory, so 100% of our graduates go on to 4-year colleges. Our students are very high achieving, so school matters a lot. It's a great place to work. I didn't think I would be in education or stay in education for very long, but when I first started there, I was like, wow, I didn't know schools like this existed. And there's definitely this magic, I think, to all girls schools. And
I can see Toy's face. This is why we do it on Zoom. We do this on Zoom, and I can just watch Toy's face, and she has so many questions in there. I know she...
In my face?
Yeah, I could tell you're like, oh,
there's nothing I would. Well, I'm really excited. I don't think there's been a podcast so far I haven't been personally angry at my kids' school and how we have no choice. So I love the school choice, and I love, I'm imagining you have very little discipline problems at your school.
Yeah, discipline. It's not to say that there's not challenges or that our students don't have. Need to have some really serious conversations, but we don't really see it as discipline in like the traditional sense. It's more about having conversations and providing that emotional support.
I love that. I have and maybe there's a better place for this question, but what I'm thinking about when I looked at Marlborough's website and the Center for its Innovation and Entrepreneurship, I was a career tech principal. And so we have these pathways. Some of our schools, public schools, have an entrepreneurship pathway, which is like usually four courses they take them like junior and senior level. And it's usually the business and marketing stuff, some finance, economics, but it's a pathway, and they have to do at least one pathway as part of their requirements for graduation. So I was wondering how the center works in terms of, is it like that? Is it like a pathway where they choose entrepreneurship as their path and they go through that, or is it like a come in and come out kind of thing?
So our Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation is actually relatively new. And so it just opened this last August, so August of 2018. And we have definitely explored that model, right, of almost like a track or a certificate program that a lot of students have, or that a lot of schools have. So that idea of maybe you study entrepreneurship, or you choose the STEM path, or maybe you choose the global citizenship path. And we ultimately decided that, at least at this point, that is not our current program. We want to open it up for students who might just want a little bit of a sample of it and say, hey, I want to take Entrepreneurship 101 as a 10th grader because it seems like it's interesting, but then maybe that's the only class I take, similar to our computer programming classes or robotics or some of our classes in media. But we are starting to develop a capstone program And we do have now an entrepreneurship capstone that we're launching this next year. And so in terms of entrepreneurship, the requirements for that are that they have to take the Entrepreneurship 101 class. We then have 2 other classes that fall within this entrepreneurship umbrella. So we now offer a personal finance class. We're launching a design for social impact class next year. And then as seniors and as juniors technically too, they can then do the entrepreneurship capstone, which is an honors credit, which in a very academic institution, we ultimately decided was important because I can get into this later on. One of the challenges we had was that some students weren't interested in taking the class and actually said, it sounds like a cool class and I'd really like to take it, but I'm afraid it's going to bring down my GPA. Because initially I had the philosophy that in entrepreneurship, just like in real life, you don't get grades. So this is going to be a pass-fail class. But and so now we have this option where, if you enroll in entrepreneurship capstone and you actually launch your business, which is a very rigorous, intense process, that does count as an honors class. And so we are getting there, and we're starting to see more and more diverse capstones, right? So we have a capstone in social justice where students pair up with a nonprofit and work with that nonprofit to solve a problem within that organization. And then we have honors capstones in dance. We do have an honors research program that's been around for quite a long time. So in many ways, yes, it is akin to those pathways. We just don't call it that.
I'm so interested.
I know. I want to go there.
So I always say, I wish I had gone to a school like Marlborough, but alas, there were no all-girls schools in Northern Michigan.
Yeah, well, it's nice. It's nice that you have that kids can sample, because a lot of times we see students that go into a pathway and then they maybe take 1 or even 2 classes and realize, oh, I don't like this. But now do I start all the way over? or do I just keep going because I have to finish this pathway, and I want to have an extra study hall next year, so I have to keep going. So it's kind of it's a mixed bag sometimes when kind of funnel kids into a specific area. So it's nice because a lot of times in life, right, it's better to know what you don't like than what you do like. So that's wonderful. But I just thought about that as something that is another sort of differentiation between private and public school.
Yeah.
I wish we had something here in the sticks that was a better option.
Right. Well, it is. I think there's always that tension, right, of specializing early. And, is it better to start early, especially if you feel like you might have an interest there and really develop that interest throughout high school before you get into college? Or is it better to sample a bunch of things and know a little bit about a lot? And I actually don't know where I fall on that spectrum. I think there's advantages to both.
Yeah. Speaking of sampling, you taught Spanish for 10 years. Oh, I'm just I'm not confused. I'm just trying to follow how this process has occurred. So you taught Spanish and then you started the entrepreneurship program. That jump is interesting to me.
It is an interesting jump. I'm glad that you asked that, because I think oftentimes with high school students, and this even builds off of that pathways question, we expect people to know, even when they graduate college, what it is that they want to do, when in reality, who really knows? Even in high school, even in college, I was a Spanish and international studies major in college. I never thought that I would end up teaching Spanish. I had spent a year abroad in college, and then after college, the actual real story is I was dating this guy in Mexico that I had met while studying abroad, and my parents said, well, we're not just going to send you to Mexico after we've paid for your college. You've got to actually do something. You're not just going to flounce around Mexico for the year. So I said, okay, that's fine. I'm going to go and get a fellowship and do something legit in Mexico. So I got a Fulbright and went back, and things with the boyfriend didn't work out, but my Spanish was really, really good. And I had this legitimate research experience, and I really loved speaking Spanish. And I thought, that's something that I can do. It was a real tangible skill that I had when I graduated. And I went to a, small liberal arts school. So, in terms of having professional tracks, liberal arts schools typically don't have that. So I started as a Spanish teacher at Marlborough when I was 22, and I loved teaching Spanish. I went and I got my master's in Spanish actually when I was there. And so actually my Penn master's is my second master's. So I love teaching Spanish. And while I was teaching Spanish, I then started, in independent schools, there's all these different leadership roles you can take on. So I was the dean for the 8th grade class for, I think, 4 years. And then I became dean of student life. And so as dean of student life, one of the projects that I was tasked with was developing our leadership program and thinking about how do we teach leadership skills to young women. And it was then that I was like, you know what, we could teach a very theoretical leadership class, right? And look at different female leaders and talk about what kind of leader you are. But we had an idea for what we wanted to do with that. But then I went to this conference called Oasis, and that's actually for anyone who's interested in teaching entrepreneurship. It's a pretty interesting conference to attend, and it's about igniting innovation in school. And it was there that I met Doris Korda, who is the founder of the Korda Institute, and she's from this school in Ohio called the Hawkins School. And she was presenting about the entrepreneurship program that she developed at Hawkins School. And I was like, I had one of those light bulb moments where she was talking about the skills that her students were learning by learning entrepreneurship. And it was then that I said, instead of teaching this course, which we were going to call real world leadership, we should just call it entrepreneurship. And by teaching entrepreneurship, we're going to teach all of these important leadership skills like collaboration, how to come up with an action plan, how you take an idea and turn it into a successful reality. And so that was that. And so then I, went through the process with our school and said, we're not going to call it real world leadership. We're going to call it entrepreneurship. And let's make this happen. And so the idea was that we would teach this course, just one section of it, the following year. So this is now this was, I think, spring 2016 that I had the light bulb moment. And then the school year of 2016, 2017, we launched entrepreneurship. And at that time, I went down to teach one Spanish class. I was doing the entrepreneurship class. And then at that point, I had taken on significant other administrative responsibilities. And so it was a lot, though, that year, because I would go from teaching entrepreneurship to teaching Spanish to then sometimes running a big all-school event. And it was then that I said, if we really want to make entrepreneurship grow and continue to, build this out in the middle school, teach more classes, I have to let something go. So that was the last year that I taught Spanish, and I miss it. But I have some ideas of how to mingle the two. I actually think it'd be really cool to do an entrepreneurship class in Spanish and, a real world Spanish class.
I'm so interested. Actually, you mentioned Doris Korda. Toy, I don't know. She was a potential speaker for our forum a couple years ago. Jean knows her. That's so weird.
I know. I was like, I know that name. Why do I know that name?
Yeah, I quickly searched my email history and we had tried to get her. That's interesting. I'll have to circle back on that opportunity. Yeah. She's based in Ohio, right across the border from us.
Yeah. I would say I then went to her institute, because I actually don't think she works with Hawkins School anymore. She then went out to, just really build out this Korda Institute, which was called Wildfire Education for a time. And now that's really what they do, is they train educators in how to use the Korda model to teach entrepreneurship. And yeah, she's really an incredible woman. I really think of as a trailblazer, because she was doing this before it was really on other schools' radars.
The entrepreneurial ecosystem's so weird. It gets such a small world, but everyone is so connected in this space. Like if you are in entrepreneurship education, it's so crazy.
Yeah.
How that all works out.
Yeah.
Sure. But I want to talk about what kind of content your girls are learning. Like we've hinted at different areas, and I know we talk about there's a lot of partnership with community-based organizations. So can you talk through that and how you, from when you started it to what it is today, what kind of things are the girls experiencing?
Yeah. So, I had, like I said, I had no business background. I had never taken a course in entrepreneurship. I had never taken a business course. And so I was very much just self-taught. And what I did was I attended the Corda Institute and started with her model. And so that first year, what we did, and we continue to do this today. So our Entrepreneurship 101 course is based off of the Corda model, where we start by throwing them in, like we do maybe 2 or 3 days of intro work or setting some sort of foundation or expectation for what the class is like. And then we immediately go off campus for our first site visit. And so on my end, I spend a lot of time developing these partnerships with a startup and with that founder or the CEO, whom I think would be a good fit for our school. And so we go off site and we start by learning about the startup, and the founder CEO then presents our students with an actual real world startup style problem that they're experiencing. And that could be everything from, they need a new go-to marketing plan, or they're thinking about launching a new product, or they want to open up a new location but aren't sure which location would be best, whatever it might be. And then our students go back and, working in groups of 3 or 4, have between, again, depending on the schedule, typically around 4 to 5 weeks to do market research and collect data, and ultimately come up with a solution that they ultimately pitch to the CEO, founder, and her team. And again, being an all-girls school, I think it's really important to connect with a female CEO or a female founder. And they typically do that twice. So they do 2 business cases. And then at the end of the semester, and it's only a semester-long course, they then spend some time working either in small groups or as individuals to present and build out a business problem that they might want to take one step further and actually launch in another class. Or just the more important thing is really just going through the process. So that was our first class, and that's kind of like our flagship course. And then the other courses that we've developed, and some of the other skills, to your question, Amber, what we really focus on, design thinking is a big part of what we do. And so developing that mindset of a designer, that you can have, all the greatest ideas in the world, but if they're still in your head and you don't put them out there, you're not going to get very far. And also that if you just rely solely on your own experience and on your own perspective, you might end up designing a product or a solution that nobody wants or that nobody needs. And so developing that mindset, developing empathy for your user, your potential customer, is so important. And it seems like it's such a basic thing, right? But it's actually much more complex and harder to teach than you would think. And so we do I spent a lot of time that first summer on like IDEO's website, looking at Stanford's D School and seeing what curriculum resources were available. And I've since adapted those to really make them work for high school students and middle school students, but that's a big part of what we do. So in our middle school class, we do more, it's like about developing products using the design thinking framework. And so we have a number of different projects now in our middle school. One of the big things is that in our Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, we have this kiosk space. And so our most recent project was that we actually ran a business. And so we ordered, and students were fully in charge. And so I had them decide first, like, what should we sell? They then had to pitch the class on why they thought we should sell that product and from where. And then they voted. And then we had to figure out, how many units to order. They actually had to sell it. They had to do a marketing plan. We then looked at the P&L sheet. We didn't end up making any money, actually, but I didn't really care because, again, it's all about the learning. So that's our middle school class, which is a little bit more basic. And then in our upper school courses, we are building out, more of this social impact and thinking about, yes, you can, and ultimately, if you look at the businesses that are the most successful today, they oftentimes, also focus on people and planet, not just profit.
So awesome. When we meet with teachers, we do a lot of teacher training as well. And we talk a lot with teachers about empathy, and it does seem so basic, but when you go through an exercise, I just did this the other day with teachers, when you go through an exercise of like looking at what's your value proposition? Who are you going to solve a problem for? And why is that problem important to be solved?
Mm-hmm.
And even when I went through the exercise, like I was so far off the mark because and that you can't, like you said, you can't like design in a bubble. You have to understand what other people need and what they want and what their issues are. I met a teacher the other day, not to go into a tangent, but that has a side job that makes almost more than his teaching job. And he, I guess wrangle would be the best word to say. He wrangles geese off of this beautiful lake that has all of these beautiful homes on it. The geese swarmed these houses, and they had to get rid of these geese. So he and his dog go out and move the geese with a remote control boat. And it was so successful that he now has like clients in all of Southeast Ohio.
That's so smart.
Right. And I'm like, wow, I would have never in a million years. But I had a question to what you're talking about with your students in your school. When you go and identify how difficult is or how easy is it to identify these businesses and get the founders on board to work with kids, because they're obviously really busy. Everyone, people want to work with kids. That's a nice thing to do. But, we bump up against that all the time where schools like, I just can't get the community involved because it's hard to take a slice out of somebody's busy day. So I'm just wondering how you do that. And if you have a cheat sheet, I would love to see that at some point.
Well, I think there's a few things that, that in my case, I just have a bit of more, I don't want, like, luck isn't quite the right word, but definitely working at a school like Marlborough that in Los Angeles is well known and like has such a long history. That helps. Although I'm always surprised, not everyone necessarily knows, what Marlborough is, but you can, if you look at the website, you see it and it's like, okay, this sounds like it's pretty legit. But I think for any school, whether or not you're a school like a public school or you're just starting out, or even if you don't have the reputation that, Marlborough has, I think the important thing to focus on is we're adding value for you. And one of the things that I always say to the CEO founder, because I usually do a lot of either cold calls or cold emails. I often sometimes will reach out via Instagram. The most recent example actually is we did a partnership with this company called Skin Owl. And I will shout out to them because their founder, CEO, Annie Tevelin, was just so amazing. But it's an example. Now I consider her actually one of my pretty good friends because we just got really close through this process. But it is testament to the power of, a cold email or just reaching out via Instagram, because I knew that I wanted to partner with a skincare company or something in the beauty industry. So I was like, that just seems like that would be really fun and different and students would really latch on to that. And so what I did is I started by just Googling startups in LA, new startups in LA, skincare, beauty, and looked what came up. And I found about 10 or 15, and I reached out to all of them. And I think this is a good example of failure and how you just have to keep going. I figured, what's the worst thing that can happen? They won't respond. That's totally fine. But I figure that out of at least typically 1 out of 10 people will respond. And so in that email though, and in that first introduction, I always start by saying, I teach entrepreneurship at Marlborough, an all-girls school, and then just lay out what it is that I'm looking for. So I'm looking to partner with your company, and this is what it would entail. And I try to make it as easy as possible for them ultimately. And one thing I always say is, while I can't guarantee that you will end up with something viable or something that you will actually want to use and implement, what I can guarantee is that you'll then have 530 students and their parents knowing about your company and knowing about your product. And that ultimately is the most, it's like free marketing for them. And I think trying to find businesses that could really use that increased exposure, because if you look at the marketing power or the market, the influence or the purchase power of this new market, that's ultimately, a huge selling point. Because one of the things that our school does as well is, on our school's Instagram, we'll talk about that partnership and we'll show, the pitches, or that, on the demo day, we might publicize those in some way, and then the founder comes to the school. So it's great marketing exposure for them, or we might write about it in the paper or in our magazine. And so I think for any school or any person looking to connect or make these partnerships with an organization is to focus on what this partnership will do for the business, even more so than what it will do for the school.
But yeah, it's so true. And Skin Owl just got two more shouts out.
Yeah. And Skin Owl is a great example because what they ultimately wanted to do. And so, then what I typically do is, the next step after that reach out, if they come back and are like, yeah, we're interested, I then will send more details about the project, the time commitments, what the expectation is for them, right? Because the expectation for them is that they'll host us for a 2 to 3 hour long visit, and that they'll lay out a problem. And then oftentimes too, and this started just by luck, our first partner did like a problem brief for us, that was 2 to 3 pages where they laid out everything from what the company was all about and then described the problem in detail. And so it helps it feel really official. And so that's one of the things that I've then asked our partners to do. And I'll usually include past briefs for them to look at so that they can model theirs off of that. And then in the case of Annie with Skin Owl, I usually will take them out to lunch or coffee so we can meet up. And we ended up having a great conversation. She was all in. And I think sometimes it does require a bit of that persistence. I just kind of hit on Annie and Skin Owl, and she was like, this is exactly what we've been looking for. We want to start marketing to teenagers and, this younger demographic, because right now people who are buying our product are more like 35 to 40. And so then she had them develop a teenage skincare starter kits. And our students were then responsible for designing 4 products and the bag itself. And they actually made it. So you can find it on the Skin Owl website, designed by Marlborough students. But I think it's, you're going to end up with some great partnerships, and it's like the perfect project. And then maybe it's not, the perfect partnership, but that's okay too. I think that as long as it's a real business and a real business problem, you're going to be able to, it's going to be high stakes without it being based on a grade, which I think is so important. And it's going to provide students with that exposure and those skills.
I love that. I'm so obsessed with the idea. And a lot of our schools, Toy, I'm sure you've experienced, are leaning that way, right? They're trying to connect with but I think you provided a really good framework on how to approach that for our listeners. I think that's a really good step. And the idea of framing the problem and having them provide that support structure instead of kind of having the students just find one on the front end is I think really supportive in terms of learning entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was writing down all of your hacks.
Yeah. I will probably should write those down somewhere because it's not a formula at this point, but I think our students aren't quite at the level of finding someone yet. They aren't there. And so if you're the teacher of it, you really have to set up the framework and then give them multiple choices or multiple paths to success where no matter what they end up doing, it's going to be a good choice no matter what.
Yeah, I think, we could talk to you literally all day, and we try to keep this around half an hour. So, Toy, I think it's probably, we'll probably have a follow-up episode with you, honestly, if you're interested. But I would love it if the final content question for you could be around what tangible advice would you give to other educators, not just in the private, but also the public, because I think it's applicable to every educator interested in entrepreneurship education.
For sure. I think entrepreneurial education is so important. And with every year, we're going to see more and more schools that are teaching entrepreneurship, even if it's just one class, which I'm thrilled about because our world is changing so quickly. And if we're thinking about what skills, tangible skills, do our graduates need to succeed in this ever-changing, rapidly changing world, I would put my bets that it's those entrepreneurial skills and having that entrepreneurial mindset. So I would say the big things is one, start by following, business leaders. Thinking even on like Instagram or your LinkedIn, think about founders that like that could be someone from Oprah to Lauren Conrad to whomever it might be that you think is interesting, and look at the products around you too. Like say, okay, like right now I'm at home, and so the Trader Joe's box of Cheerios is right in front of me. Like, what's the founder story of Trader Joe's? Like, who founded it? How did they get started? And just start learning and researching the products even that you use every day, and what the story is of how those products and businesses got started. I always think that's really interesting. And then another great thing to do is start listening to business podcasts. And so I listen religiously to the How I Built This podcast by Guy Raz.
Yep. You see us nodding. That's like, yeah, that is such a good one.
So good, because it just, again, and it's great for students to listen to those too. I do assign those as homework because I think students and adults alike sometimes have this idea that businesses were just made and don't know the struggle and the many, many years that went into building a business. And so I think that's really integral to expanding both your as the instructor, your entrepreneurial mindset, as well as to helping students build theirs. Other podcasts that I love Women at Work by Harvard Business Review. I listen to that a lot. That's more about like women and leadership. But for anyone who's trying to get things done and make changes in their own workplace, especially as a woman, that's a great one. Because ultimately, I see teaching entrepreneurship as a way to bring about more gender equality in the workplace, which could be a whole other episode. But I love that one. And then I think just reading, I subscribe to a number of business magazines that I devoured when I first started out, because I was like, I don't know anything about this. And so let me just look for more examples and see, and even learning about companies that might be, in LA or be in California or be in our own backyard that I've never heard about. And so I read pretty steadily Harvard Business Review. I love Entrepreneur Magazine, Fast Company, Inc. Those ones are all really great. I subscribe as well to The Hustle, which is a daily newsletter with business news, and I'll oftentimes use those examples in my class as well. Those are things that I just do on a regular basis that I used to not do, but have helped me develop my own confidence in teaching this class. And ultimately, that really helped me take on this new title of Director of Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Another thing I would say is attend the conferences that work for you. There's so many education conferences, but I went to that first workshop with Doris Korda, which I think is actually priced pretty reasonably, and that was super helpful.
I'm going to put a shameless plug here for the Entre Ed Forum.
Oh, yeah, is that you guys?
Yeah. It's in September, actually, in Lexington. So, and the whole conference is on how to do this in the classroom. So, yeah shameless plug. You heard it here.
Yeah.
And it's very affordable.
Yeah. Find those forums. And I think it just requires a little bit of research and digging, right? Like sometimes we think, oh, nobody else is doing this, but there's a lot of resources already out there. Like I said, for design thinking, I didn't really know what that was. Stanford has a number of 3-day workshops where you can go and learn about design thinking. But for those of you who can't, fly out to California and actually attend that, there are a number of free resources on IDEO's website, on the D School's website. And then just, start following people, on entrepreneurial educators on social media, and you can get a lot of ideas from them too, because there are a number of, since this is becoming more popular, there's just more and more conferences that talk about entrepreneurship and education. Yeah. So just dive right in.
I love that. I think that you're probably one of the first people that has listed tangible things for people. So I appreciate that. We'll just I saw Toy jotting down. I've been jotting down all these resources just to, the best thing you can do, right, is just be educated yourself.
Yeah.
And exactly. Seek out that knowledge. So I'm really appreciative of that for sure.
It's so awesome when we talk to amazing entrepreneurial educators like yourself, because educators don't always identify as being entrepreneurial, but all of the things that you just talked about, from knowing zero to like, and being a Spanish teacher. And then you're like, this is inspiring, lightning bolt hit. And I'm going to devour all of this stuff because it's that perseverance and that tenaciousness that's part of the entrepreneurial spirit and drive. Absolutely. And so when we meet these great educators, it's like, you actually are the epitome of an entrepreneur, just in a different kind of setting. So it's really awesome.
Yeah. In many ways. I mean, I do tell people like, you're starting a new class or you're running a new program. You are being entrepreneurial. It's almost like you're running this mini startup within a school, and instead of your customers are your students, and your class is going to run whether or not students enroll. And so, if you don't have enough students who say, hey, that class sounds interesting, I want to do it, then they're not going to run your class. And so you have to be thinking about, what do my students need? What's going to create demand? How am I going to market this to students and make it interesting, and also make it interesting to parents? Because parents will say, you know what, you should really take that class. That's all part of it. And so definitely, I think that all teachers need to be entrepreneurial. And right now there's this weird thing happening. I mean, I think that still the word entrepreneurship is seen as this dirty word in education, which drives me crazy because it's not a dirty word. Entrepreneurship is about solving problems and making the world a better place. And so, I mean, that's another challenge, I think, is, just rebranding what entrepreneurship means in schools and why it's important. So that's the next thing on my list that I want to work on at my
We're just going to start like preach, girl, just keep going. Honestly. But yeah, we're so appreciative of your time. What you've presented today in terms of how you went from your whole trajectory is just fascinating to us. And so we were really inspired by everything that you said, and we hope that our listeners are too. Yeah. How might they follow you or find you or touch base with you?
I'm so glad you asked, because I also have so many Instagrams at this point. Like, I run my school's Instagram, or I've kind of stepped away from that. But I did just start literally have one post, an Instagram account for my entrepreneurial educator side. And so that Instagram handle is _entrepreneurial_educator. So you can find me there on Instagram, and I'll be posting more, content related to what we're actually doing in the class, as well as, ideas for those who are just starting out or thinking about teaching entrepreneurship. And then I also have a Twitter handle that, because grad school has been so crazy, I haven't been using as often, but will be getting more into. And that is at Entre, _educator.
That's great. And then, we'll definitely keep in touch. And as you continue to grow your programs, we'd love to have you back for episode 2. We say that to every single one of our guests.
That's because we pick really awesome guests.
Yeah, I would love to come back. And
we have so much to cover.
I know there's so much stuff. And I think a really cool topic that I'm starting to explore more is like, how can you leverage the city or the town, wherever it is that you work, or wherever you're based? How can you use that as your learning environment? And so in our case, like Los Angeles, there's so much you can do in the city of LA, or even within 1 mile of the school. But if you're trying to set up that problem-solving mindset, there's problems everywhere. So how to actually develop those projects, no matter where you might be.
Okay, that's the title of episode 2. Regina Rosi Mitchell, episode 2, how to create entrepreneurial communities.
Yeah, absolutely.
We got you.
Yeah.
But we're so appreciative, and thank you so much for your time, and we'll let you know when this publishes, and This is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much. It was great meeting you.
Nice to meet you too.